Good afternoon to everybody. Morag and myself are here to chat to you this afternoon on peer observation of teaching in a pandemic, in an online context, and the implications for educational development. So my name is Martina Crehan. I'm an educational developer at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, University of Medicine and Health Sciences. My colleague Morag Munro from Maynooth University is here with me, and we are also, or should also be joined by Dr. Muireann O'Keefe from the Technological University of Dublin, but she's unable to join us today. So this short workshop and the work on which it's based is an evolution of a project on peer observation of teaching, which the three of us have been working on for a number of years. And we had all been involved in peer observation of teaching work in, I suppose, one form or another in our respective institutions. And we became very interested in the potential for cross-institutional and cross-disciplinary peer observation. So we had been conducting a piece of work on that. And this year we expanded the focus to the narrative of the views and the perceptions of the participants against the backdrop of the very rapid adaptation of learning we've all engaged in as a result of the COVID pandemic, and specifically in relation to the participants' perspectives on peer observation in an online context. So we're going to share with you some of the learnings from that and do a little bit of thinking and a little bit of talking about your thoughts and your impressions of peer observation in an online context. So what we've set out to try and achieve in the session this afternoon is to look at some of the challenges and benefits associated with peer observation in online contexts, explore how to develop that sense of trust and collegiality, identify the factors which contribute to successful online peer observation of teaching, and obviously specifically discuss the role of the educational developer in particularly scaffolding that sense of trust and that sense of community. And I suppose one of the things that we're very conscious of here is particularly the purpose of peer observation of teaching. So I always like the quote from Parker J. Palmer, The Courage to Teach. I'm sure many of you will have read that or come across that particular publication. And he talks about, the fact that we cannot see what is out there merely by looking around. Everything depends on the lenses through which we view the world. And by putting on new lenses, we can see things that would otherwise remain invisible. And that's very true of peer observation of teaching. And I think even more true in the context of peer observation of teaching in the current environment, and how we have to reshape our thinking and reshape our approach whilst maintaining the principles of peer observation of teaching in an online context. Oops. So we have just a quick question for you to start, and we just wanted to get a sense from you as to whether you've participated in or facilitated peer observation of teaching in an online context. So we have a Mentimeter link, and I know there aren't very many of us in the session, but Morag will pop that into the chat. And I will then share. So if anybody has any problems getting access to that, maybe just let us know.
This is interesting because I've actually responded.
Ah, it's not coming through.
And it's not coming up.
It just sometimes takes a little bit of time, or even Martina, if you want to refresh your browser, it might come up there.
Okay, let me do that.
But because we're a small group as well, if anyone wants to just jump in and tell us if you have used peer observation of teaching online, that would be great.
I can jump in straight off and say we discussed it, and we didn't do it, but some colleagues decided, we said we're not having peer observation this year, but one or two people decided that they'd do things like look at people's resources on Moodle, and if they were co-teaching, they used that as an opportunity then to potentially see what others were doing.
Great, thank you, Judith.
Yeah. Shall I come in?
Yes, perfect, thank you.
Yeah, so at Bradford University, I support colleagues as well who are working towards professional recognition. So one of the requirements is that they should have peer observation reports. So I've observed a couple of people during the pandemic. So the procedure is we do the pre-observation meetings. We discuss what the colleague is going to be teaching. And then after that, we do the observation. And after the observation, we arrange the post-observation meeting to discuss the feedback. So it basically, it goes on. The observations went on well, but I could see the difference. You don't see much, especially from the side of students, the engagement, because what we noticed during the pandemic is almost all the students were not turning their cameras on. And no matter how much the teacher was trying to prompt them to engage, that dynamic was not quite evident in online environments. So yeah, that was one of the big challenges.
Absolutely, thank you, Gladson. That's, I think, a feeling and an experience shared by many. The dynamic is very, very different for all of those reasons. Thank you very much. Great.
Isabel's posted in the chat for you as well.
Lovely. Okay, Morag, you might just keep an eye on that, if you will, please. Thank you. Perfect. Okay, so let me go back to the PowerPoint. So I think the points that have been raised there have been, I'm sure, shared and experienced by all over the past year or so. But just to bring you back a little bit in terms of the starting point of our project and how we arrived at talking to our participants about this in the online context. Back in 2017, Morag and Muireann and I initiated a collaborative cross-disciplinary and cross-institutional scheme of peer observation of teaching across 3 higher education institutions in Ireland. And the project, or the scheme's vision, was to really open the doors of our cross-disciplinary classrooms with a view to fostering dialogue, collaboration and reflection about teaching and learning practices. We based our process around Gosling's peer review model, which I'm sure all be familiar with. And we had 10 volunteers with previous experience of observation of teaching and or other educational development opportunities from a range of disciplinary backgrounds. And we supported them through a peer observation of teaching process, which was underpinned by induction, dialogue and reflection on the experience. The commonalities, again, as I said, the participants came from a number of different disciplines, but the commonality was large group teaching. So they were all involved in large group teaching in their respective disciplines and institutions, and the peer observation process was grounded within that. We evaluated this process and we looked at the impact and the outcomes of that innovation, and really hoped that the output would lead to that advancement of teaching and learning whilst fostering reflection on practice. The findings very generally from that first part of the project, so certainly highlighted the perceived benefits of faculty viewing their teaching practice through that different lens, particularly in the cross-institutional context. And there was very much an appetite for future cross-institutional and cross-disciplinary observation of teaching schemes or opportunities. We also uncovered, I think, a number of themes which were perceived to underpin the conditions conducive to fostering professional dialogue. So the key enablers really included the cross-institutional and cross-disciplinary context, a phased approach to the reflective process and the conversations. And again, this idea, this theme that keeps emerging, the creation of a sense of safety and trust to facilitate open and authentic conversations. And again, the role of ourselves as educational developers, as designers and co-reflectors in the process, also very much scaffolded these enablers. So we had always intended to return to and to further develop the work. And it seemed quite clear how we would do that. And we had a plan in what we now know were the relatively calm waters of 2017. And as we started to plan, the storms of a pandemic struck, and we grappled with how we might actually proceed, given the challenges which all educators were facing. So we stayed in contact with our original participants, and we know that their conversations were continuing against that backdrop of that very rapid online adaptation of teaching and learning practices. Not surprisingly, some participants were discussing how their peer observations and how their reflective dialogue experiences were becoming more and more digitally mediated and supported. So the role of peer observation in the online environment started very much to come to the fore. Our original group were really interested in coming back together in a reflective discussion and exploring this, so we decided to persevere. So in December 2020, we brought the group back together in an online focus group. And what we set out to do here was to really seek insights into the participants' experiences and perceptions of peer observation of teaching in the online environment. We had 6 participants from the original group. And we had previously identified some insights into the conditions which were most conducive to the nurturing of this dialogue in relation to observation. So in this research, we felt it timely to consider some questions yet to be addressed with respect to the role that peer observation might play in the online context. So what does it mean? How do people define peer observation of teaching in the online context? Should it be concerned with synchronous teaching or only asynchronous approaches? What are observers giving feedback on? What do they feel comfortable with providing feedback on in the online context? And how, as educational developers, can we support the development of trust, rapport, and community that's essential to successful peer observation in the online environment? So what emerged? Well, not surprisingly, peer observation of teaching was experienced very differently than when implemented face-to-face. And again, not surprisingly, building trust and collegiality came to the fore. And specific support and guidance for online peer observation was very clearly highlighted. In the solely online environment, and we're all obviously very familiar with the importance of this over the past year, building relationships and respect and a sense of community among teaching colleagues becomes and became even more important, but also I think even more nuanced and complex. So our challenges and potential solutions focus on that need to very carefully consider how we support and frame peer observation in the online context. We need very specific and tailored plans and frameworks to scaffold it and to create that sense of community and trust. We also saw a very clear challenge and opportunity to have explicit conversations about defining teaching online and how that impacts on peer observation. For our participants, many aspects of peer observation don't simply translate directly online, and it raises questions in relation to the focus of the observation process. For a number of our participants, this was a very central theme, and it was linked to their views on the authenticity of the experience and that need to redefine what it means in an online environment. For example, there was a sense that the online context shifts the focus to quite technical and teacher performance aspects rather than student reactions and interactions. And we've seen that in your comments, Gladson, there a little bit earlier. So as educational developers, we have to consider how we support and facilitate educators in planning peer observation online. How do we help them to reflect on the focus of that peer observation and try and move away from that focus on the technical and procedural? So that leads us to consider the need for guidance specifically tailored to peer observation, both synchronous and asynchronous in the online context. most of our institutions have very well-established frameworks and support for face-to-face peer observation. So how does that need to be redefined? How can we model best practice? How can we provide exemplars of peer observation of teaching online? And as one participant commented, can we ensure that online observation of teaching becomes part of holistic teaching processes and becomes more normalized in our online environment? So very centrally, the role of the academic or the educational developer in creating that sense of safety, creating those listening environments, opportunities for honesty and openness, the focus on the pedagogy, the reflective conversations, all of the things that we know are so important in the face-to-face context. How do we translate them into an online setting? So we hope that it's a helpful first step in starting to work through some of these challenges. And what we'd like to consider with you over the course of the next few minutes is how can we best utilize and support peer observation of teaching in the online context, and hope that this will contribute to further work and further research in this area. So I'll hand over to Morag to introduce you to the next stage.
So thank you, Martina, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. So as Martina said, we hope that in the session today we can begin to collaboratively build up a better picture of how those of us working in academic and educational development can best support peer observation of teaching in the context of an increasing focus on online and blended teaching. So we've put together a series of prompt questions to frame that dialogue, and those have come out of the discussions with our peer observation participants that Martina has just outlined, as well as our own reflections as educational developers. So for each of the prompts, we're going to invite you to first contribute to a Google Jamboard so that we can begin to crowdsource perspectives of educational developers, and also just to keep a memory of our discussion today. As Martina mentioned, we'd really like to build those anonymous contributions into future research, so please bear that in mind if you do choose to contribute to the Jamboard. And then after each Jamboard question, we'll open up the floor for discussion around each of the points. So I'll just share the link to the Jamboard now, and I think Martina is going to share that on screen too now so that we can all see what is going on and see the contributions as they come in. Wonderful, thank you, Martina. So the first thing that we'd like you to think about is, what does peer observation of teaching mean in the online context? Because I think until quite recently, when we spoke about peer observation of teaching, we were most generally referring to observation of a live event, a live teaching event, such as a lecture or a small group teaching session. But in the context of an increasing focus on online and blended learning, that changes a bit. And of particular relevance in that context is that when we talk about online and blended teaching, we're now increasingly both referring to synchronous or live teaching, as well as asynchronous teaching. So whether that be recorded lectures, facilitating online discussions, or even the design of the learning environment that students will engage with. So with that in mind, the first prompt questions on the Jamboard are, what does peer observation of teaching mean in an online context? And should peer observation of teaching in online environments be concerned with asynchronous teaching only, or should synchronous teaching, or should asynchronous approaches now be considered? So if you haven't contributed to a Jamboard before, what you need to do is on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see a link to add a sticky note. And if you click on that, you'll be able to type in the text as Martina is doing now, and then just click Save to contribute to the Jamboard. So we'll just give you a couple of minutes to contribute if you'd like, and then we can bring it back to the floor for some discussion. So that's great. I can see your contributions coming in now. I love how it assigns you all an anonymous animal. It's all really interesting. So someone is agreeing we do need to look at asynchronous and synchronous teaching. But that's quite a change, isn't it? Because it does change in terms of what we're actually observing. That's quite a significant change into what we mean by peer observation of teaching. It's really expanding those boundaries quite a bit. And someone contributing around guidance and what has been set at the institutional level. And I think that's really important. And as you say, you know, peer observation of teaching does link to what we define by teaching in an online context, I guess, in terms of what that leads to in terms of the peer observation element. And someone again mentioning guidance and support. Does anyone want to come in and contribute using the mic, just in terms of any thoughts that you have around this, around what we are looking at in the context of an online peer observation of teaching and around observing in both synchronous and asynchronous contexts? Isabel, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I'll come and just start people off. It was my organisation that we produced this well.
Sorry, Morag, can you hear me actually? Yeah.
Sorry, thank you, Claire. I think Isabel is just contributing now, and we'll come to you in a moment if that's okay. Thank you.
Of course, thank you.
Sorry about that. I didn't know who started first. It was my organisation that produced the guidance of what good online looked like. And what I put in the second sticky note there is that I'm finding a little bit of resistance of doing the same thing for live classroom teaching. That seems much more a protected space where they don't want to be encouraged to have that conversation, but it's okay to do it on the online. And one of the things that we focused on is, as you'd imagine, is engagement, student engagement, both when it's synchronous and asynchronous. So what do you do to put across the passion and tasks? We've done an awful lot of work with what is a task. So, you know, just simply asking a learner to read something or go and look at something is not a task. So we've done a bit of work on engagement, making meaningful tasks to support that engagement. And what we haven't done yet, which I'd really like to do from a linguistics perspective, is look at floor taking, you know, turn taking and floor taking. And Claire's just done a great example there of, in a live room, this is okay, but it feels a little bit awkward maybe on the online. So that's maybe something to come down the line. So that's my start you off contribution.
Thank you, Isabel. That's really interesting. I think focusing on student engagement is a great focus here. It does raise a question around how do we know that students are engaged, and Gladstone mentioned this already around not being able to see our students. So when we are observing in a traditional context, we see both the teacher and the students and we get a sense of engagement. It is much, much more difficult in the context of an online environment to see, like, is that engagement actually happening? But really interesting, thank you. Claire, do you want to come in there?
Okay, yeah, thanks Amelia, and sorry for interrupting. I've got very dodgy Wi-Fi here in the wilds of Mayo, so you'll just have to excuse me. I'll leave my picture off for now if that's okay. But just to say, I'm really enjoying the session so far, and I would certainly concur with the view that both synchronous and asynchronous are beneficial if possible. And I suppose I'm saying that based on a very small scale project we did just between October and December, just previously, where we used both in a small way, in that we asked our participants to look at one another's live synchronous teaching. We kind of had a sort of a triad type of an arrangement where we asked to, each of the participants to look in one session of the other's live Zoom classroom teaching. And we also looked, as well as part of the project, at their VLE pages. So we had a little bit of time beforehand and after to look at how people had designed, if you like, their virtual learning environment as well. And we used to actually kind of a snapshot of the Quality Matters framework just to kind of guide the conversation around that. Now we've only, as I said, involved in that project in the past while, but it was at the height of the pandemic, and I suppose what was kind of useful about it was that the vast majority of people in there, in fact 9 of the 10 had never done peer observation before, so it was quite interesting to see it in the online. So I was just making a case for both, and that a recent focus group seemed to confirm that participants seem to get benefit out of getting feedback on both. And the other piece of feedback that they said was one synchronous session was not enough. So I'll stop now for now.
That's great. Thank you, Claire. Really interesting. And it's kind of interesting as well, I think, until the last year or so, in the context of things like peer observation online, we haven't really had the opportunity to see, for example, others' VLE pages. We generally only see ours or a couple of trusted colleagues. So this is a great opportunity to move beyond synchronous to be able to get feedback on other elements of learning and teaching in online context. So really interesting. So Mary, do you want to come in before we move to our next question?
Hi. Hi, thank you. Yes, I was just going to say that we've been using, one of my colleagues developed a form that would be suitable for people who are doing observations for the HEA that was different for asynchronous as opposed to synchronous. And we've been using both of those, but I'm sort of aware that they're looking at very different sorts of things. So picking up on what other people have said. I'm sorry I've got to dip out of this meeting, unfortunately, because I've got another meeting coming.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the
contribution. Thanks.
Well, thank you for the contribution, Mary, and it actually is a really good segue into our next set of questions. As Martina mentioned earlier, there's really a sense that online teaching can be bound up with some mechanistic elements that aren't necessarily to do with teaching per se. So our next question for you to consider in that context is, what are observers giving feedback on in online peer observation of teaching? And what is more and what is less important in that context? So to move to that next question in the Jamboard, if you haven't already, just go to the top of the screen and you should see there's a next frame arrow to move on to the next question set. And again, we'll give you a couple of minutes to contribute.
Hi, sorry, Sandra. Hang on, you're mute. Oh, you're on mute? Oh, right. No, I was just in a conference session. Just got another 5 minutes, but actually I've got it in the background.
Martina, can you mute Mary there? Are you able to do that? I can't. Thanks, brilliant. So some contributions coming in there now, which is really great. So someone says a good question. What we did was provide training on using a coaching style conversation for talking about feedback and what worked well. that was less threatening. So yeah, really interesting, I suppose, in terms of some of the elements that we might give feedback on in the traditional face-to-face context. Those do change, and I suppose they're part of those things are to do with communication in an online context as opposed to communication face-to-face, and the things that work face-to-face that maybe do not translate to online. So really interesting there too. And someone's mentioning the community of inquiry model, and that's that's actually a great idea to build things around that model in terms of what we're observing. Thank you for that contribution. That's really great. Does anyone want to come in just and take the mic and elaborate on anything that you've said on the Jamboard? And paralinguistic features are more or less important. That's really, really interesting, isn't it? It's really interesting in terms of, you know, again, in the online environment, those cues may not be as visible or easily understood or misinterpreted as well. A lot of us teach with our hands a lot, and you know that doesn't work so well in an online environment. Sometimes a lot of us like to move around the room. All of those things are not possible. So really interesting. But I'll stop talking now and just see, does anyone want to grab the mic and contribute?
Yeah, just picking up on what you've just said there, Morag. I mean, I think this is hugely problematic because if you're thinking about how you engage with a class of students, it's totally different if you're in front of a camera, isn't it? Especially if you're doing something asynchronously. And how many of us have had training to deliver in that way, because it all happens so very, very quickly. So I think to pick up on some of the things that you would do in a face-to-face observation, it's really tricky until that training is there. And then you could start to say, well, you know, okay, perhaps you need to think about this aspect or that. Sorry, I'm finding this really thought-provoking, but I'm not sure that's quite what you wanted to have. And shut up.
No, absolutely, Judith. I think that's a really good, and you know, it's meant to be thought-provoking and reflective. And I think, you know, from just thinking about this as you're all talking, you know, I think the passage of time will be really interesting on this. So, you know, what we found in our research was that, and again, it's because, you know, people were just starting out with online teaching. We're in this very scary and very daunting space, and that's the lens through which they were looking at this. So of course, they were overly concerned with those very technical aspects. So, you know, what does my slide look like? And have I got too much text in the slide? And am I moving my hands too much as I'm demonstrating there? And I think as people start to become more familiar and more comfortable with the online teaching context, then those other elements come into play. People have a little bit more cognitive space and emotional space to actually think about those other aspects in the context of this form of teaching and what they might seek feedback on. So it'll be interesting to see how that changes over time.
I have to let you know that you've got 5 minutes left.
Okay, thank you, Judith. So we might move on. And again, that was a really nice segue into the next question that we have. And we're first asking this in the context, I suppose, of your roles as educational developers. And you know, how do you feel about giving feedback on online teaching when you may not consider yourself to be an expert in this area? I mean, I don't think we know what an expert in this area looks like, because do we know really, truly what good online teaching is? I think that's still open to debate. So thinking about yourself, how do you feel about giving feedback? But also perhaps think about that from the perspectives of colleagues. How do they feel in that context when we're asking them to give feedback on online teaching when it may not be a space that they're entirely comfortable with themselves? And again, you can move on to the next question on the Jamboard and make your contributions. Okay, again, some really valuable contributions coming in. So really great point around this taking a coaching approach. So not necessarily assuming the role of the expert. Does anyone want, perhaps the person who made that contribution, would you feel comfortable coming in to talk a little bit more about that? Because I think it's a really great point.
Hi, Morag, that was me. So we've got a number of people in the academic development team, a number of people, there's only 3 or 4 of us, but we all happen to have coaching experience and expertise as well. So we set up this this mock feedback session and filmed it so we could show people, you know, what are the powerful questions, how do you ask them? And it is really about, you know, when anybody comes into your office, any learner, any member of staff, you don't always have the answers, but you know what questions to ask them. And that literally is it, because then it kind of teases out more ability for you to talk about, well, why was that? Let's have a think about what happened before that happened in the classroom. Where might it come from? And that seems to work really well. And we're taking that forward now with our new peer observation scheme that we're just writing up at the moment. And we're going to make this training mandatory for people before they start on the peer observation. So it might be useful for us all to get together in a short while time to kind of think about, you know, whether we can contribute to each other's literature of the peer observation agenda.
Oh, it'd be wonderful, Isabel, and it sounds really interesting. I really like that as an idea because, again, you know, moving it into a coaching space makes it a safer space, I think, for everyone. I guess, again, it's, as you are doing, setting up an environment where people feel comfortable that they can do that. Okay, we might just move on really quickly. I know that we're pushed for time now, so to move on to the next question, and I think is an important one. Actually, will we move on to the next one again, Martina, because perhaps this one is more important. Because one of the things that we found that when we talked to our participants was the importance of building up collegiality and trust really was something that came up time and time again. And they spoke about how much they valued meeting each other in informal settings. So, for example, at our introductory workshops, having a coffee beforehand, having a tour of the campus, they really value that as making them feel safe before they open the doors of their classrooms and letting their peers in and observe them. So in that context, we're asking, I guess, is how can we as educational developers support that building of trust and collegiality? And I think building on the model that you mentioned, Isabel, it could be a great way to do that. But are there any other practical strategies that we might want to use? Okay, wonderful. Some great contributions coming in. So guidelines and case studies. That's great. And someone's saying that that I suppose they want us as an educational developers to lead on the scheme, close the loop. That's really interesting in terms of our own role over a longitudinal role, I think, in this process as well, in terms of helping colleagues to build those relationships, but to sustain them over time. And, you know, thinking about how can we do that in an online context when people may not have the opportunity to meet each other. One of the things that we found from our participants was that while the online space makes it easier in a way to conduct observation of teaching, it does make it harder to actually build up that safe space prior to conducting an observation. So I think that's where we come in. I'm really conscious, Judith, we need to finish up, don't we?
Yeah, we do. So, I mean, we can have a minute or two more, but we need to vacate so that this can be used for the next meeting. So if I could ask you to wrap up.
Yeah, we can, of course. Thank you so much for all of your contributions today. It's really been fantastic, really great insights from all of you. In terms of our future work, myself, Martina and Muireann are looking at developing some guidelines on peer observation of teaching in online environments. And it sounds like that's work that some of you are already ahead of us in, so that's great, and we'd love to be in touch to discuss that. We'll leave that Jamboard open if you would like to continue to contribute, or even if you have any colleagues who would like to contribute. We'd love to have your feedback. And again, thanks again for your participation today.
Thank you. That's really been fantastic, and that should be conference rather than conference. But I mean, if we can encourage you to maybe bring this to the next conference and update us, and perhaps we'll get chance for Isabel and Gladstone and Claire to bring in much more to the discussion. But I'm sure everybody will agree with me that that's been really thought-provoking. Thank you very much, both of you. So we need to just give you a round of applause.